preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
This series on Critic's Choice. And tonight we have the privilege and honor of having the critic for New York Magazine, David Denby, here to show you a film that I think most of you have either not seen or know little about. But I think by the end of this evening you will be both hopefully one of a film that you'll know a lot more about and also enjoy a lot more. And to preface the film and talk about it in a little bit to orient you in this series, David will make some remarks about why he selected this film as his critic's choice in this particular series. David Denby of New York Magazine.
Thanks. The movie is Dodsworth from the Sinclair Lewis novel. The novel was written in 1929. The movie was made in 1936, kind of high Hollywood years of prosperity, and it stars Walter Huston, Ruth Chatterton, and Mary Astor. And I'm not sure that this choice can be justified in some of the usual ways. You couldn't say that it's a great work of cinematic art, and there isn't any kind of burning directorial vision. The director is William Wyler, who is the super craftsman of American movies in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And you don't go to Wyler, this is not to be confused with Billy Wilder, very different sensibility, but you don't go to William Wyler for that kind of directorial personality that we think of as defining a great director. What you have in Wyler is this devotion to bringing out whatever is in the subject, the dramatic material, and sort of losing his own personality in glorifying his actors. I mean, he directed Bette Davis in probably her three greatest performances, Jezebel and The Letter and The Little Foxes. Anyway, I think you'll get a feeling almost in the opening sequences of the kind of craftsmanship that's here. It's about a marriage that is falling apart, and it's one of the more serious movies of the 30s, and I think one of the least pretentious and more enjoyable serious movies of that period. It's one of the rare adult American movies. These two people are not young. The man is 50-ish, and his wife is 40-ish, and Sam Dodsworth is very much passionately even in love with this woman whom he has never really understood, and his wife is beginning to fall out of love with him. That's the situation at the beginning. They are people who have made a great deal of money in the Middle West and have always felt themselves lacking experience in some way, that they feel that they're yearning for something to get away from this kind of the business that he's devoted his life to and the small town society that she's devoted her life to, and so they go off to Europe. It's a theme that may have meant more in the 20s when Americans made these kind of pilgrimages to Europe and felt that they needed to have this adventure of culture or that America could not provide and that Europe could. And so it'd be interesting to think of that in terms of the 20s and Hemingway and so on. Now, Sinclair Lewis was there at the same time in Paris and so on. Wyler really stays very close to these two people, and I think that's why it's special. There's real character depth, and that's something that every week I sit there with my editor and I complain another movie that doesn't have real characters in it today. I mean, it's very, very rare now where you could get completely caught up in the characters on screen. That's somehow old-fashioned to have people in depth in a movie. I seem to be seeing more and more movies with great cinematography or brilliant sort of directors' conceptions and no real people on the screen. I think Shoot the Moon is one current example of something that does have some real people in it, and it's perhaps not a coincidence that that is also about a marriage that's falling apart. I think what Wyler's aiming at is kind of the emotional continuity from scene to scene and within scenes. There's one extraordinary scene here to look for, and that is that they are having an argument and slowly getting undressed. It's just an ordinary argument. It's an ordinary night. They're getting undressed and going to bed. And I can't think of any other American movie that has something that on the surface is so mundane and yet sort of develops kind of dramatic tensions underneath that as it proceeds. And he tries to shoot that particular scene with as few cuts as possible. In other words, so that even within a shot, the moment by moment relation of the characters, they're sort of going back and forth at each other, is sustained. You'll see one extraordinary shot where I think he picks up Ruth Chatterton, the wife, at the far side of the room and follows her into the foreground, and then goes and picks up Walter Huston and then brings them together, and then they go apart again. You'll see it, and maybe we'll talk about that scene later. Another reason I chose it is that Walter Huston has sort of been forgotten. This is the father rather, of the great director John Huston. He was born, I think, in 1883 or 1884. He was basically a theater actor who came to movies when sound came in 1929, so he was already in his middle 40s. He was not beautiful. He was not handsome or graceful. I mean, in that way, he was very much a theatrically trained person, sort of stocky, and the kind of fantastic integrity as an actor I think you'll enjoy. He played Abraham Lincoln in D.W. Griffith's last movie, 1930. Abraham Lincoln is the name of the movie, the sound film, the only sound film Griffith made. And he was opposite Joan Crawford as the Reverend Davidson to Joan Crawford's Sadie Thompson in Rain, a terrible movie, but you can get some feeling for his range of that. He's most famous, I guess, as the old prospector in his son's greatest movie, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, a performance for which he won the Oscar as Best Supporting Actor. He was beaten out for Dodsworth by Paul Muni, who won that year for the Story of Louis Pasteur. But this is his greatest performance, I think, and it's a kind of definitive interpretation of the American businessman who is very powerful in many ways, but yet suffers terribly from this feeling of inadequacy, feels that he's missed out on life, that there's some shimmering vision out there that if he can just get a hold of it, and he doesn't even know what it is, some poetry, if he can just find it and hold on to it. I just want to say one thing, a little bit about the production. As I said, the novel was written in 29. It was Sam Goldwyn who produced it. He was then offered the rights to the book for $20,000, and he turned it down. It was then turned into a play by a playwright named Sidney Howard and was very successful on Broadway in 1934 with Walter Huston, starring Faye Bainter as the wife and Walter Huston's own wife, Nan Sunderland, playing the other woman who is in the movie, Mary Astor. Goldwyn then bought the rights for Dodsworth for $160,000, 8 times the cost, and said, I don't care, and the thing is now a successful play, and it has that much more value. Actually, it's a great thing that they waited until it was turned into a play, because Sidney Howard, when he adapted it, sharpened it and tightened it and made it more dramatic and brought the characters into confrontations that are not in the novel, and I'll maybe afterwards mention a few things. And then when they came about to making the movie, they had this very dramatic structure with all these confrontations, and they started to feed back novelistic detail into it, around the sides, around the edges, the European settings and so on, all those things that must have been impossible to do in any kind of detail on stage. However, the whole thing was shot in Hollywood, right there in the Goldwyn Studios on North Formosa Avenue in the Hollywood Flats, and they did send a cameraman off to London and Paris and Naples to get some background shots, which they then used on a rear screen, through rear screen projection. In other words, they put the background on the screen and built the sets in front of it. So this is old-fashioned Hollywood craftsmanship where you did the whole thing in the studio. They didn't have to go off to Europe then and spend $25 million. They stayed at home because they knew what they were doing. So here is Dodsworth.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the making of the film, a little bit more about some of the personalities?
Well, one thing that's interesting, Mary Astor, so beautiful in this, was at the time of the making of the movie in 1936 the most scandalous woman in America, because in 1935 the playwright George S. Kaufman had gone to California to work on A Day at the Races for the Marx Brothers, and she had had an affair with him, and then she and her husband divorced that year, or the next year, and she gave her husband custody of their child, and then in 1936 changed her mind and sued him for custody in court, and he countersued by gaining control somehow of her diary, the diary that she kept during her affair with George S. Kaufman. And he could not get it admitted into court, but the CAD leaked it to the press. And it was extremely explicit about her sexual relations with Kaufman. And so this was all going on while they were shooting this movie. And whenever she wasn't working, she was racing off to the courtroom to testify or to meet with her lawyer or something, and they finally came to some settlement where she got the child for 9 months and the husband got it for 3 months. But anyway, Wyler was always having to calm her down. The whole story is very much like a Marx Brothers comedy, because Kaufman didn't want to go into court, so he kept running away, and MGM, he was working for MGM, so Thalberg spirited him off to Catalina Island, and the court officials went chasing after him. He escaped on the other side out of a boat, and then he was at Moss Hart's house in Palm Springs later on, and the police came again, and he went out through the window and through the bushes, and they finally loaded him onto a train in a stretcher, which is like something out of Hitchcock. But someone leaked that he was on the train, and all the reporters were waiting in New York, and he got off at Westport or something to avoid the press. Let's see, some other things. Well, the movie won was not a great hit because it's about.
It had about 8 nominations.
It had a lot of nominations. It won. It won only one, actually, the set decoration. And you can see the set decoration is extremely skillful and lavish, but no more than adequate. I mean, it's perfect, but they didn't build unnecessary sets or huge backgrounds or anything. It's all, about the proper scale. But Houston was beaten out by Paul Muni for the story of Louis Pasteur, a rather sanctimonious movie, and the best picture, I think, was also the story of Louis Pasteur. And Maria Uspenskaya was nominated for the Kurt's mother was nominated for.
Yeah, there's that one scene, though, the marvelous scene, which was unfortunately in this print, that one line that she just digs in there and says that.
What she says is, "Do you realize how little pleasure there is for the wife of a young man?"
Yeah.
So that's and it was that word pleasure that was clipped out in the print at that point. Other interesting things. I mentioned that Sidney Howard, the playwright, made things more confrontational. Believe it or not, the scene with Kurt's mother was not in the novel. I mean, it was related by Fran to Sam in a letter. So that whole scene, which is very stagey but very effective, was not there. The confrontation with Arnold Islin that was something that Sidney Howard devised that was not in the novel at all. She simply broke off with Arnold Island before Sam came to Europe. And the coup de théâtre of the recurring telephone call at the end was not in the novel either, and was added. Another curiosity, Arnold Island in the novel was Arnold Israel, and was in fact an American Jewish playboy who was in Europe, and not a European, and was very young. That was her first lover. So, and I think it has in the novel slightly anti-Semitic overtones. Sinclair Lewis, seeing her, yielding her Gentile flesh to a Jewish man, being part of her disintegration. So Goldwyn, not wanting to deal with issues like that, I have the feeling, turned him into, Paul Lucas, a Hungarian emigre in his middle 50s, and very suave and very charming. The movie is full of Europeans, like so many Hollywood movies. All of these refugees from Europe washed up on the shores of Los Angeles, escaping from fascism. Very often wound up playing fascists, as a matter of fact, because they had accents, and they could be sinister. So they could play Nazis. But in this one, not.
What it struck me was the film still plays well today, obviously, and yet it has this kind of mid-depression mentality about it. This notion that leisure is something the Europeans do, Americans work. And the leisure will get you into trouble, and work will make for progress.
He's lost when he's not
and he's
working. He's this American
sitting there drinking,
wandering around. He knows there's something in Europe that if he can figure out what it is, it's a woman, and an American woman.
But it's only a woman that's living in a $50 a month apartment, even though it's a beautiful apartment.
Well, she said it was cheap, and that was what she told him on shipboard. What do you want? But because I can't believe that, even in 1936 in Naples.
But there was all those movies that made the rich look to be horrible. A lot of those screwball comedies that made people with lots of money look like fools and imbeciles, and people with heart, really good people and moral and virtuous. And he, even though he had millions, he came through in the end in terms of his own integrity.
Yeah, I think it's what I love about Walter Huston's performance is that he is really, I think, very convincing as a businessman, and most actors can't play businessmen because there's something in Walter Huston occasionally that gets very cold and very ruthless, and you could see how he could be a self-made man and a tycoon, a very decisive way. He handles certain situations, and then
that grandmother scene where he sort of where he talks to her as being your grandmother now.
There's of course the movie is certainly on his side. She's shallow and snobbish, and she's a social climber, and he's the person of integrity who really adores his wife and yet doesn't understand her, and is very very strong and very modest, and yet there's some shading. He sticks the knife into her more than once, as you say. He keeps twitting her about her age, and I feel. As I see it, the first time I saw it, all I saw was Ruth Chatterton being affected and sort of bitchy. But the second time, I think you do feel her hunger for experience and for pleasure and for sex and for dancing and for Europe, and glamour and everything. And I experience that now with some sympathy, which is I've got to have this fling. After all, she has brought up his kids in that presumably awful town in the Midwest that they're living in. And I'm not sure I would want to spend endless days with that other couple drinking and playing cards, nice as they are. So there is some sympathy. Her greatest failure, of course, is that she desperately undervalues her husband. That he really is a good guy, and she can't. She thinks that he's a fool, and actually he's very intelligent and just extremely aware of his limitations. And she thinks that she's so worldly, and she misreads absolutely every single person she deals with, certainly all the Europeans, who are always manipulating in ways that she doesn't catch on until too late. Yeah. But Wyler claims that he had a terrible struggle with Ruth Chatterton, and that she wanted to play it strictly as the heavy, and that he wanted to build more sympathy for Fran, to make it a little more equal. And I don't know why Ruth Chatterton wanted to play it that way, possibly because Fran is not interested in her own children. That's my guess, and maybe that struck her as really unforgivable, that she could be wrong about men or about her husband, but to be so indifferent to her own daughter having a baby. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's just
well, marriage was such an important thing at that time, too. I mean,
yeah.
And the sanctity of it. That's why the film has some kind of real charge to it, the fact that he gives it up.
Yeah, because the bonds between them are very strong. Yeah. I mean, and he's really stricken when he realizes that he can. I mean, and even I think it really works for me. It really works emotionally. Even that lachrymose violin theme, that real, Act 30s music score, I find it very affecting. And sometimes the violin, sometimes the solo cello, it's associated with his loneliness, although it shifts to her after Kurt walks out on her or betrays her, or suddenly the violin, that theme shifts to Fran. So I mean, also that's another point, I think, when your sympathy starts to go back towards Fran a little bit.
He gets stronger too.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing about the ages of the two women, that scene everyone laughed when Mary Astor indicates that she knows that Ruth Chatterton is lying about her age. In fact, Mary Astor is too young for this role because she was only 30, and Ruth Chatterton was 43. She looks. And they look their respective ages. I mean, I think. Mary Astor never became a big star, and I think the reason was that she lacked the common touch, that there was something very refined about her. And finally, people began to use her in a kind of ironic way. Her most famous role probably is as Bridget O'Shaughnessy in The Maltese Falcon, John Huston's first film, where she's a refined liar, and she's very ladylike and very poised and mature as here, but lies and lies and lies through her teeth. And so people began to use her comically, but she was in something like 100 movies, almost always in small roles, and she was always beautiful. She's still alive. She's 76. And she's written 2 volumes of autobiography. And Ruth Chatterton, after her career collapsed, which was right after this movie, became a novelist. So there's a lot of talented people involved in this.
Yeah, David Niven, Spring Byington.
David Niven, Spring Byington. John Payne was the son-in-law, the sort of dumb-looking, good-looking guy. And he went on to have a big career in the 40s in musicals, and then in the 50s in westerns and everything. Paul Lucas was the older European.
Let's have some questions for people.
Or comments.
Comments? Must have some. Yeah.
I want to just have a sort of very general question, and that is, it's such a pleasure to see such good acting.
Yeah.
Such polished performances on so many different levels in this movie. And my question is a very general one, and it has to do with the state of acting now. We have, our Diane Keatons and Albert Finneys, I suppose, every once in a while. But by and large, I miss that kind of professionalism. And I see types, from sort of over and over again. What are the prospects, or where are we headed with
Well, the first thing that occurs to me about this movie, as opposed to now, is that these people were all trained theater actors and were successful. I mean, Ruth Chatterton was a New York Broadway theater star when she was 21 or 22 or something. Walter Huston was always powerful in the theater and played this role, as I said before, in the theater. And the Europeans were all theater actors and movie actors as well who came here. I don't know. I mean, there have been some strong actors who have come out of the New York theater in recent years, like Al Pacino and Dustin Hoffman and several others. There were a lot of lousy actors in the 30s too. I find it hard to to generalize. They're not. It's the roles also. You have to need. I mean, these roles were written by Sidney Howard.
Well, also they're written better. I mean, the lines.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things you have in most modern cinema is the intervention of the editor and the director in such a way that takes away from the actor. In this, the actor creates a space, and the director creates a space, and the actors just fill it with emotion and movement and gesture. And so.
It's it. I mean, Wyler really built those performances. His method is psychological and dramatic rather than poetic. And the whole movie is not some directorial conception. I mean, it's really a writer's conception to which the director has lent, his strength. So the performances are framed, just as you say, and just a few things to point at. Wyler likes to play scenes in depth. There's a lot of scenes where someone will be in the foreground and someone else will be in the background, and that may be one of the things that, as a director, apart from his obvious skill in every aspect of movie making, but that's one of his unique contributions was composition in depth, which certain French critics and theoreticians have seen as having a kind of moral significance, because the viewer has the freedom to look either at one place or the other. That is, rather than the viewer's attention being directed through cutting to exactly what the director wants to show, the viewer is given the freedom to look at different areas of the screen.
Yeah, there was that one scene where they're talking themselves as a triangle, and they actually set themselves up with in the middle and the two women on the side.
But I mean, the most obvious thing, like the telephone at the end, and when the telephone is in the foreground, and they're way, way in the back there, and they're both in focus. It's all in focus, and this is early when this is not done until about now. I mean, and Wyler pioneered that. But actors great actors are created in part by great roles. I mean, and they have to be written. And once the director became, around 15 years ago, became sort of the creative center in Hollywood. And director like Francis Coppola conceived the entire movie before actors were thought of. It's the whole emphasis has shifted
to the fact that the actors now become the directors.
Well, in some cases,
Redford and
the actors are tired of being, not having decent kinds of roles, and so they try to control their projects. I mean, that's what Jane Fonda and Redford and others are doing.
Yeah.
You were talking about slanted the movie for Walter Houston. I remember after reading the book, Sinclair Lewis, who was having an affair with Dorothy Parker at the time, and subsequently married
Dorothy Thompson. Yeah.
Mary Astor was modeled as the perfect, pure woman.
Yeah.
Because he was having quite a battle with his wife at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, Mark Shorer's biography of Sinclair Lewis goes into this in some detail. I mean, Shorer feels that Fran is a rather harsh portrait of Sinclair Lewis's first wife, and that this novel is a kind of vindictive working off of anger on her, and that, as you say, Mrs. Courtwright is a idealized portrait of his second wife, Dorothy Thompson, whom he met in Berlin in 1929. And after he met her, he started to write Dodsworth because I think he was happy and it freed him up in some way. And she became kind of his ideal of what American woman should evolve to. That is, a woman who was kind of independent there and who was self-sufficient and who was neither possessive nor wanted to be possessed. And Dorothy Thompson, in case people don't know, was the most famous woman journalist, American woman journalist of the 30s, and was a kind of globe-trotting columnist, and they had a very unhappy marriage, as it happens. But Lewis never resolved this whole question of America versus Europe, and he picked up this theme from Henry James, who devoted his whole life to it. I mean, this kind of contrasting and balancing and weighing of mores and manners and morals of Europe and America, and I think this that Lewis, like James, deep down really loves the American, but on the other hand he prefers to live in Europe, and that's what happened to both of them. They both died in Europe. Lewis died in 1950 in Florence.
More questions? Just one other comment on this. That interesting to see the allusion to the Soviet. I mean, this is 1936, and the Popular Front, and sort of the Soviet. This image of the Soviet was a kind of ally at this time. The whole notion of anti-communism, which started toward the end of the decade. And this, you still had that kind of notion of the Russian man. They talked about the Russian friend.
In fact, Walter Huston played in Mission to Moscow in 1943, which was actually a pro-Soviet movie, and was of some embarrassment 5 years later when HUAC began its investigation. It was one of the ones that they could not explain away. But well, I mean, it was during the alliance with the Soviet Union, but it's not even not only pro-Soviet, it's pro-Stalinist. It's
Uncle
an embarrassing movie, But Walter Huston felt that way.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us this film, David. And
thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Next week we'll have the last of this series with Judith Crist, and we'll be showing a very contemporary film, one that came out last year, called The Stuntman.
That was fun.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.